So we're after Purim. I hope everybody had a great and meaningful Purim. But obviously, when we're after Purim, that signals the start to Pesach, or the preparation to Pesach. You know, they say a story about Pesach that there was once a person checking for chametz. You know, the night before Pesach, we do something called bedikas chametz. We check the house for chametz with a candle, and traditionally we put out 10 pieces of bread of chametz to search for, so whatever the halachic reason is. And the woman of the house frantically calls up the rabbi at 1 o'clock in the morning and says, "We have a problem. My husband cannot find the 10th piece," which is a problem. So the rabbi looks into it and he says, "You know what? Don't worry. There are ways of getting around this. It's halachic loopholes. We can work out something." So she tells the rabbi, "No, you don't understand. Am I allowed to tell my husband where it is?" So this is a joke which is said. Many lessons can be learned out of this joke, but some people have a custom, which is a good custom, that they actually do not tell the person where the bread is. They keep it to themselves, so the person actually is searching for it and looking for it. You don't have to do that. Some people do it, some people don't. But the bottom line is that this is a classic example of somebody sort of overemphasizing the custom over the actual law. So the law is you need to actually find the chametz, but this person was worried about, not telling her husband because there is a custom that you hide it without telling the person who's actually searching. Which leads us into the topic of today, Chumros or nonsense. Now, Chumros mean stringencies. Stringencies exist throughout the entire Judaism. We have Chumros, we are strict about many things. Many things, there's the basic halachic requirement, and then we go beyond the letter of the law and we are machmir, we are strict, we add on stringencies. Now, many stringencies are brought down within Jewish law itself. Some stringencies have just been Jews have accepted upon themselves throughout the generation. And these are various levels of Chumros. But particularly when it comes to Pesach, we find an extreme emphasis on the concept of Chumros, of having stringencies that a person should, God forbid, end up eating or owning chametz. We find this when it comes to cleaning for Pesach. In Jewish houses, we go above and beyond to clean the house, to scrub the house from every last crumb, although not necessarily, if you go according to the letter of the law, would you be required to do so. But nevertheless, the custom in every Jewish home is that we scrub and we clean and we try to get rid of every single last crumb of chametz. And I'm not talking about sorting out drawers of clothing. That has nothing to do with Pesach. That's just because some people decide, I guess, because they're cleaning for Pesach, we might as well do spring cleaning as well. Those have no connection. What I'm talking about is actually Pesach cleaning, just going a little bit above and beyond. Especially when it comes to Pesach itself, when you're actually on Pesach. Here you have a whole list of chumras that many different families and groups within Judaism have. This person doesn't eat that, that family doesn't eat that, these type of Hasidim don't eat that, these type of Jews don't eat that. They say a joke that if you were to not eat everything that someone has a custom not to eat, you would probably end up actually not eating anything on Pesach. That's how many chumras and stringencies there are when it comes to Pesach. So we need to understand, number one, what is the concept behind that? Why do we have so many stringencies when it comes to Pesach? Why, when it comes to Pesach, do we seem to go extremely, so to speak, quote unquote, meshuggah, crazy about how many chumras people have? And again, every community has their own chumras. We're not getting into the differences, but just the general concept. The idea of having chumras, of having stringencies, seems to be a particular emphasis when it comes to Pesach. But we'll answer that on Thursday, on part 2 of this. But what I want to focus on today is more a general outlook on the idea of being a machmir, of being strict in general. And on this itself, we can ask 2 questions. First of all, wouldn't you think that on an educational level, it's not such a good thing? Let's take, for example, Pesach. If we are not only not eating bread on Pesach, or not chametz, the minimal requirement, but we're going with sugar and not eating, some people have a custom not to eat tomatoes or onions or whatever the case is, wouldn't that be too much for our children? Wouldn't that be too strenuous? And wouldn't they come to resent Pesach perhaps? And then on a third question, it seems to be, when we start being extra strict, sometimes what can happen is people may start to mix up things and start saying, you know what, the chumrah, the stringency, and the actual law seem to be on the same level. So if I'm not going to be machmir, I might as well just throw out the whole thing, which is sometimes what happens. It's unfortunate. Sometimes people say, if I can't do the whole thing, so I won't do anything. So maybe we shouldn't be focusing at all on being strict. Maybe we should just be focusing on the actual letter of the law and telling people what the basic minimal requirement, especially when we're talking about people who are just now coming close to Judaism, who are just now accepting upon themselves to keep certain mitzvahs. Perhaps it would be better not to be extra strict because that may be too difficult for everyone to accept upon themselves. Let's just focus on the minimal requirement, the letter of the law. So they are all good questions, but I want to focus on today is the last two when it comes to education and in general, how do we make sure that we don't conflate the chumrah with the din, the stringency with the actual halacha, with the actual law. So perhaps we can say like this. In general, two things can be true at once. Sometimes we find it very hard to do that. Myself included, everybody finds it very hard to take two sides of one coin and put it together. Sometimes when things seem to be in conflict, we would rather just go to the extreme of one side than actually have both sides come together. And over here it's the same thing. On the one hand, it is true that we should not conflate, and it actually is quite dangerous to conflate a chumrah or a minig, which those two things are two separate things, but for the sake of our discussion, chumrah is a stringency with the actual letter of the law. And the reason why that is dangerous is because, as we mentioned before, if I say they're both equal, then what happens when I decide that, I'm not actually holding by not eating onions on Pesach? Let's say, I come from a family which doesn't eat onions on Pesach, which happens to be not true, but let's say I do, I have a stringency, our family have a tradition, we don't eat onions on Pesach. Let's say I'm not up to doing that. If I have these two things as equal at the law of not eating chametz, with a stringency not to eat onions on Pesach, whatever the case is, or not to eat spices, some people have a custom. Then if I drop the spices, what will happen is I'll drop the chametz as well. And that's dangerous. We do need to educate other people, and yes, even our children, that there are different levels. There is the actual mitzvah, and that there's a chumrah. That is true. That just takes education. That just takes explaining how halacha works. That there's the literal letter of the law, and then there are chumros, there are stringencies. There are stringencies which are brought in halacha, which are even more important to keep. And then there are stringencies which are family tradition, which are also very important, but not as important. And if yes, if yes, at some point a person seems it to be too difficult to take on everything, of course they should only take on the letter of the law. And especially when someone's just starting to come close to Judaism, of course we shouldn't tell them all the stringencies and all the customs that everybody has. Of course, just emphasize the actual mitzvah. For example, let's take Pesach, of not eating chametz. Then if a person wants to grow and take on extra stringencies, of course that's good. But we should never conflate the two. That is true, and it is dangerous to conflate the two. That is the two, and that is also true. But that doesn't negate the importance and the value of a chumrah. Two things can be true at once. Yes, it could be true that it is dangerous to conflate the two and to mix up the two, but that doesn't take away from the value and even an educational value of a chumrah, of a stringency, of being strict in halacha, of taking the law to the next step, of going beyond the letter of the law, of being extra strict. The value of that is that it expresses commitment and a connection and a bond and a relationship with God. When we keep His commandments, we do it because He's our King, and He tells us to do it, so we do it because we have to. Where do we show, where do we express, where do we display our love to Hashem? Where do we display our connection and the fact that we have a relationship with Him? When we are strict, when we go beyond the letter of the law, and we say, I'm not going to just do what I need to do, but I'm going to be extra careful on Pesach not to eat chametz. I'm going to go totally beyond the letter of the law to make sure that I don't ever transgress a commandment of Hashem. Let's bring an example that you can sort of see these two sides. Let's say as a parent, you ask your child to clean their room. Clean their room. Not for Pesach, clean their room. And you define exactly what you mean by cleaning the room. Make your bed, pick up the loose things off the floor, and straighten your desk. However, cleaning your room doesn't only mean that. It could also mean putting furniture polish on the desk, making everything look absolutely spotless and shiny and clean. But the parent doesn't tell it to the child, because if the parent would, that may be too difficult and it'll just be a waste of time. And the child will say, oh, you want me to also polish the furniture? Forget it. So what does the parent do? No, there's minimum requirements. This is what I want you to do. This is the goal. The goal is to clean the room, do the basic things, and then you will have fulfilled my commandment. However, let's say the child wants to show that they really love the parent, and they really want to pay back the parent for all that they've done for them. They want to build a relationship with them. And the child wouldn't only clean the room, but go the extra mile, polish the furniture, do it extra, make the room look spotless and clean and beautiful, although the parent actually never asked you to do that. Now, just like in this case, these are two levels, these are two separate things. There's actually cleaning the room, that is what the parent wants you to do. If you don't feel like polishing the furniture, you shouldn't say, oh, you know what, I'm not going to polish the furniture, so I won't even straighten my bed, I won't even straighten the room. Of course, that's ridiculous. No one would say that. Because the point is, what the parent actually wants is you to clean the room. That doesn't negate the fact how much happier the parent would be if the parent walks in afterwards and sees, and not only did you do exactly what I required you to do, but you went the extra mile. You did it extra. That shows that the child did it out of love, didn't just do it because they had to, but because they wanted to. So those two things are true. We're not mixing up the two ideas. One is the requirement and one is extra. And we need to educate people that. We need to tell people that. That is true. However, that what is also true is that we should never laugh at and put down and negate the power of a chumrah, the power of going that extra mile, even on an educational level. Even if when we educate our children, we educate to do the minimum, and we don't necessarily impose on them every single chumrah that you have. But what really impresses your children? What will really impress upon them the idea that we need to serve God and do what God wants, not only if we keep His mitzvahs, but if we do the chumros as well, if we're machmir, if we go the extra mile, if we go beyond the letter of the law. Because then the child will see that you're not only doing it because you have to. Rather, your child will see that you're doing it because you love what you do. You love Judaism. You love the mitzvahs. You do not want to do an aveira, and therefore you're trying to stay away from it, and therefore you're being machmir, therefore you're being strict. So yes, to summarize, two things can be true at once. We don't need to conflate a chumrah with a din. You don't need to say that my family custom of not eating tomatoes on Pesach, if it would be, is the same as not eating bread on Pesach. Of course you shouldn't say that. However, one should never negate the value and the specialty and the uniqueness that a chumrah or a minig, which is a slightly different thing, brings out and expresses. It expresses a deep love for what we do. And this also brings us to the second question that we asked. Wouldn't this turn off your children? This is more of a practical idea. It will if you do the chumrah in a way that you're doing it because you have to. That sort of loses the whole purpose. If you do it in a way of pressure and I wish I wouldn't have to do this, but I'm doing it anyway because this is what my family told me to do, then obviously that's not going to work. However, if you're machmir, whether it's Pesach or any other mitzvah, or any other part of Judaism, out of love, and the child sees that the reason why you're doing it is because you love Hashem, and therefore you want to go the extra mile and do the mitzvah properly, that will only impress upon your child how important it is to keep a mitzvah. Now, practically speaking, not necessarily do you need to force or even tell your child to do every single chumrah on a personal level. I come from a family which is extremely machmir on Pesach. But not every chumrah that was kept was forced upon the children. You're a child, maybe you're not holding there yet. That did two things. First of all, that impressed upon me that there's a chumrah and there's not eating chametz and they're not the same thing. But it made that it wasn't a pressure and I didn't feel a resentment towards it because it wasn't forced upon me. Rather, I saw the preciousness of the mitzvah of not eating chametz, the preciousness of the mitzvah of Pesach, that in the house we are more machmir, in the house we are more strict, and then as it grew older, you take upon yourself more and more. So to summarize, the concept is like this. It is true that we should never conflate a chumrah with a din, a stringency with the actual halacha. These are two separate things, and it may be even dangerous to conflate the two. But that doesn't take away from the value of the chumrah and the importance of the chumrah and the educational importance of the chumrah, because actually sometimes What attracts the attention of the children even more than the actual mitzvah is the chumrah. Sometimes it impresses upon them the love of the mitzvah even more than the actual mitzvah itself. So two things can be true at once. On Thursday, please God, we will discuss the specific connection to Pesach and why we find by Pesach people have a lot of chumras. Have a wonderful day.